Welcome, everyone, to the BGC Book Club Monday night event. I'm so excited to be here with you again for an extra special conversation with a couple of outstanding authors who have put together their first book. They're friends, they're writers. It's just a really great experience that I know we're going to have. So, as you come on in the room, you can let us know where you're joining us from, if this is your first time or whatever the case may be. I'm Marcy Thomas, founder of BGC Book Club and Brown Girl Collective. BGC Book Club has been around for about 2.5 years. Brown Girl Collective has actually been around for 13 years. So this is something that I love doing at all times, being able to celebrate Black women and stories about, by, for, and about us, as we say. So this story is no different. It actually has a little different twist, which you're going to learn about here very shortly. So come on in and please feel free to share this out. And if you're watching it later, thank you for taking time to check in and watch the video later. So I'm super excited tonight because we're going to be talking about The Thread Collectors, which is the brand new novel from Shaunna J and Alyson Richman. It's a very wonderful story that talks about, a variety of things which we're going to get into this evening, but I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. But by way of introduction, let me tell you about our writers. We have Shaunna J. Edwards, who is a native Louisianian who majored in literature at Harvard College before attending NYU School of Law. She's a former corporate lawyer who now works in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She lives in Harlem with her husband, and for her, The Thread Collectors is her debut novel, co-authored with her great friend Alyson Richman. Now, Alyson Richman is the USA Today best-selling and #1 international author of several historical novels, including The Velvet Hours, The Garden of Letters, and The Lost Wife. Alyson graduated from Wellesley College with a degree in art history and Japanese studies. She is an accomplished painter, and her novels combine her deep love of art, historical research, and travel. She lives on Long Island with her husband and 2 children. So without any further delay, let's welcome to the room Shaunna J. Edwards and Alyson Richman. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you, Marcy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you for inviting us, Marcy. It's a great honor.
Oh, yes, I'm super excited. You see the big smile on my face. As I was telling you, ladies, I had a chance to read the book and really dive in and learn some things, see some things that were familiar, and even be inspired to do some more, study and research on my own. So I guess first and foremost, you all are friends. How long have you guys been friends?
Over a decade. This is a real friendship. It's not made up for the book.
Yes, okay. I think like almost 14 years at this point, right?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. So you all have known each other for a while. And of course, as friends, you share stories, you talk about families and things like that over time. So what was it that actually inspired you to come together and kind of loosely tell some of your family stories as well as just tell the joint story together?
Absolutely. Well, maybe I'll dive in first. So Alyson and I, when we met, and believe it or not, we met in Vegas. Her husband's a lawyer. We were at a lawyer's conference. And when she told me she was a writer, I was fascinated. Obviously, as an English lit major, I have a love of words. I have a love of stories. But to meet someone that makes their living telling stories, for me, that was like mind blowing. And so every time Alyson and I would get together, I'd ask her, it's like, fangirling one-on-one. I'm like, what are you working on? What are you writing? I even got her to come to one of my book clubs before. And in 2017, we're sitting around, we're having a glass of wine. And I asked her the question I always ask her, Marcy, what are you working on? She often has a lot of ideas in her head at the same time. And she told me she had just seen this documentary from Rick Burns called Death in the Civil War. And I don't think she knew at the time that I'm fascinated by Civil War history. As a Black woman growing up in the South, living in New Orleans, it feels very present. And in watching the documentary, she learned some things from her perspective. I think she hadn't been aware, and Alyson, tell me if I'm wrong, but she hadn't been aware that like 180,000 Black men fought in the Civil War. And even more importantly, it was new to her that Black men weren't allowed to fight. That they fled from slavery and then they joined the Union Army where they're just put to work again. And so these things, she was talking about how they impacted her. And she also mentioned learning that because the death toll was so high, that people were buried basically where they fell. And oftentimes the Black men had to bury them. And then soldiers would write little maps and go to loved ones and say, this is where your loved ones' bodies were. So all of these things were swirling around. And she was talking about it. And she started to say, it would be so interesting if there was an unexpected friendship between a white soldier and a Black soldier, and the Black soldier created this map to reunite the white widow with the body of her loved one. I would say almost immediately, in like a flash, I saw something even more for the Black soldier, right? Because whenever I see a Black character introduced in a book, I want to know about the backstory, right? I don't just want them to be a device that moves the plot forward. So I said, well, what if he gave this map that would probably have to be rudimentary because he wouldn't be able to read or write, to his beloved? And she created needle and thread and made something permanent and beautiful. And what would that look like? And so we had this wonderful exchange. It might have been 2 glasses of wine. It might not have been one. And at the end of it, though, we didn't start writing that book. That was in 2017. We hugged, we walked away. And we didn't pick it up until, Alyson, I don't know if you want to talk about when you reached out.
Yeah. So I reached out to Shaunna in 2020, in the spring of 2020, a few days after the brutal murder of George Floyd.
Mhm.
And I just remember having this feeling flood through me at that time of feeling that the world is so broken and I need to be able to devote myself to something that has a sense of purpose. And I remembered this meeting with Shaunna where we had this collaborative idea of a friendship between a Black soldier and a white soldier. And I always tell Shaunna that, when you sit down to write a book, you have to feel that in the air, in your bones, and every part of your body is directing you to, this is the project that you're going to sit down and spend countless hours working on, that you feel it in your soul. And I think in 2017, I didn't have that feel. I felt like it was many fragmented pieces, but the wind wasn't pushing me in the direction of, this is the book you need to write now. And I think that's because we didn't leave there thinking, could we do this together? Maybe there was something just in our personal lives at that time that didn't push us towards that. But all of a sudden I felt the wind on my back, like, pick up the phone with Shaunna. She contributed so much to this idea of this book. And can we work on something in the throes of the pandemic when we're also, wrestling with all the social injustice that's prevalent in our society, and do something which we nicknamed our legacy project, that we could pull together to write something that we were proud of, that was historically accurate and showed the darkness of what was happening during that time period that ironically was quite parallel to some of the things that we were experiencing in 2020, but also find the light. Find those, rays of light that emerge even when there is despair and there is a feeling of brokenness. Can we still heal? Can we still find friendship? The power of love and family, all those things that we wanted to bring into writing this book sort of came together. But as I'll pass it on to Shaunna, it wasn't like when I picked up the phone and said, do you want to write this book with me? She was like, absolutely. There was,
there was hesitancy, and I'm sure that many of you who are listening in can relate. It was wonderful to feel the allyship of so many people at that time,
Right.
but I was very raw. And when your girlfriend, a great girlfriend, but your white girlfriend picks up the phone and asks you if you want to write about a book about race, no matter how eloquently she phrases it, you have to dig deep within yourself. And I knew that because Alyson loves historical fiction and I'm a historical fiction lover, we're both pretty meticulous, we would have to research. And so, do I want to be living through what we were living through and still continue to live through, helping an organization tackle their own DE&I issues, and then spending every single minute of my free time going back to historical records of the Civil War, which is brutal. And I had to have a lot of conversations with myself and also my then fiance, now husband, about how that was going to impact me emotionally before I said yes. But I said yes, and I'm so glad that I did, because the level of honesty I've been able to bring to my relationship with Alyson in a cross racial friendship is deeper than anything I've ever been able to do before. Just like the radical honesty and the quality of conversations that we can have because we've been working on this project and we made those commitments to each other at the outset.
Right, and that's just so powerful because in reading the story, and I'll have you all tell a little bit about what the story is about for those who haven't had a chance to read it. But as I was reading it, and as I told you, it's very fresh for me. One of the things I kept saying is like there are all these people for even within families, there's a difference for this reason or another. There's a lot of differences that could, in many cases, tear people apart. In some cases, do tear people apart. But in your story, it's like they are woven or threaded together. See what I did there? But yeah, they're able to be woven and threaded together, in spite of all these things that would have them be different. And that was one of the things that's really powerful. And, we need to see more of that in the world.
We do.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So, for those who haven't had a chance to read The Threat Collectors yet, and both of you can tag team or do however you want to do that, let us know or let them know, because I already do, let them know what the story is actually about.
Well, maybe I'll take this one, Alyson.
Please, yes.
Okay, so in the Thread Collectors, you have two couples. There's one black couple and there's one white. And the black couple, there's a woman named Stella. She is living in New Orleans. She's being held in sexual bondage, but she's really in love with William, and he is a brilliant, brilliant musician. He's also enslaved. You also have a Jewish couple. You have Jacob. He's our German Jewish immigrant. He's married to this really fiery abolitionist woman named Lily, and they're living up in New York. And at a certain point, Lily tells Jacob, put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to ride with me, you're an abolitionist too. I need you to join the Union Army. And it's on the battlefields in Louisiana where the two men meet, where William and Jacob, both of them are musicians. They forge a bond, and some difficult things happen to them, but they rely on each other. They're both outsiders in the Union Army, but they have each other's friendship and they have their love of music. And it's through their friendship you see how their beloveds are really surviving through the war. Stella's at home in New Orleans. She's with her mama Janie. She's with her sister Amine, and she's secretly making mats with needle and thread to help enslaved men run and join the Union Army. And then you have Lily. She's up in New York, and she really probably wants to be on the front line making speeches, but she's doing what women of her class get to do. She's in a quilting circle, and she's selling quilts and sending quilts down to Jacob with her love. And it's what happens in this really seminal battle in Louisiana, where I'm from, at Port Hudson. That's what sets off the chain of events that brings all of these characters together. But what I think is really special about the book is that even though you have these broad, sweeping things behind, like these battles and these incidents that Lily tells from up north in letters, it's also the quiet moments, right? It's like, how do you get along in a house with three women who are differently situated and view the world differently, and each one of them is going through their own pain? And how do when you want to be doing more, you want to have a central role in a movement, but you're a woman and they kind of tell you to do this, right? Like, how do you still find purpose? There's so many different things that are in the book that are really resonant with just how we live our daily lives and interact with the people around us. And I think it's wonderful to see that against the backdrop of something huge like the Civil War.
Absolutely. And Alyson, as I was saying to you earlier, one of the things that stood out to me is of course we know about, the blacks and, I would say Americans, people who came to America, to establish the country, that we know kind of about that sense of black and white. But you also bring in something different with the Jewish heritage. Tell us a little bit about that, because that was something new for me.
Well, I'm so happy that you learned something new in the book, because that was something I think that really Shaun and I wanted to make sure that we were pulling from two different lenses and examining the Civil War through, two groups of people that often are overlooked in historical books, that, what their experience was during the Civil War. So for me, I grew up with my grandmother was a wonderful storyteller, and ever since I could remember, she used to tell me that we had Southern relatives that the family basically lost contact with after the Civil War. Um, my family emigrated from Germany to the United States in the 1850s. 100% of Jewish heritage. At that time, the the Jewish immigrant experience in America was very small. It was less than 0.5% of the entire population. But one of my great uncles went down to Mississippi to expand his business, his mercantile business, while his younger brother Jacob remained in New York. And Jacob Kling, basically like the character in our novel, enlists as a musician in the Union Army. So according to my grandmother, this political and philosophical divide of what side you chose during the Civil War permanently separated the family and they lost contact. But as a novelist, I was really fascinated by this fraternal relationship that would become permanently broken, especially when you put it in context that they were both immigrants to America, both fleeing political persecution to start a new life. And here I have one relative, probably to protect his economic, situation, sides with the Confederacy, while his younger brother chooses a far more noble and appropriate response, in my opinion, by fighting against slavery and joining the Union Army. So I always wanted to sort of have that relationship to explore in a Civil War novel. But again, going back to what we described, it never felt right. It never felt enough. Like, where was the meat going to be? But I feel that once Shaunna and I made the commitment to create what became the Thread Collectors, we wanted to make sure that parts of history that we had never seen represented in literature were, were illuminated, were amplified in this book. And so, we did a lot of research, through different sources of what the Jewish experience was in the Civil War. Only 8,000 Jewish soldiers did fight, and 6,000 about on the Union side, 2,000 on the Northern side. And the anti-Semitism and the exclusion that they felt as minorities. The word shoddy comes from, this neither Shaunna and I realized this before the book, but it was in reference to shoddy workmanship that they, a lot of anti-Semites claimed were Jewish, factory makers who were trying to rip off the army and blaming Jews for the that shoddiness, and that comes from that word. So we were very surprised about that. Also, that General Grant at one point in the war expelled a large portion of Jewish soldiers from different regions who had enlisted because he didn't trust them. And so this type of anti-Semitism, exclusionary sort of mentality was something that we wanted to highlight. And I, obviously because I am Jewish, felt it was very important to me.
Right. And, for me as the reader, I mean, it was important to see it and to learn that. But then also, as I mentioned to you earlier, Alyson, I grew up in a neighborhood in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, that was a heavily Jewish population. And so there were certain things that I learned, whether it was having those holidays off, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, instead of having an Easter break, we would have like a Passover break, just certain things that were different. But even with that, it was still a level of not really knowing all of the history. Of course, I knew, the Holocaust and things like that, and, enslavement in biblical times, and things like that. But, I find that there are those, common threads of experience that we have gone through. And so it was good to kind of see that played out in the story and how these two people came together and formulated a friendship.
Wonderful. And, I went to a school in New Orleans that was originally founded as a Jewish orphanage in 1903. So I went to school with many Jewish people, and a lot of the things that we learned, I had no idea about. And I have to say, I told Alyson, I was a little ashamed. Shoddy is definitely a word that I've used. And it's just one of those things, the more you just kind of change your vocabulary. There was this constant exchange between us. We would share a little bit of our heritage, or we would read something, and we would become, through the process, irrevocably changed. And I think that was something that both of us will walk away with. I'm very proud of the beautiful book that we created, but I'm equally proud of the fact that both of us were open to learning and having our eyes opened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. And you kind of alluded to one of the other questions I was going to ask. Of course, it's changed and evolved your friendship as well. Just learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I just, I said to Shaunna that there were so many epiphanies as I was writing and researching the book with her of, and also trying to read in parallel of us creating it. I read Tia Miles' book, All That She Carried, about Ashley Sack. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read that, but it basically tries to, doesn't try, it successfully recreate, tries to put the pieces together of a flour sack that a mother, as she's being torn apart from her daughter during times of slavery, places in the sack things that she hopes her daughter will know how much she loves her. She packs toothpick pans, a cutting of her hair, a clean, dress. And is it her granddaughter years later who takes the sack that's been passed down and embroiders what was placed in the sack. So it becomes this artifact of family history. And, the threads are color coded so that, red means love, green means hope. And we were very much inspired by that coded thread language that we put in our book. But as I was reading Tia Miles' book, I called Shaunna and I said, this book reads to me as a Jewish person like a Holocaust novel. Or a Holocaust book, about being ripped away, never being able to see your daughter again, about the brutality and, the beatings and all of these terrible hardships. And Shaunna just very flatly on the telephone was like, of course it does. And I remember like my ignorance coming out in just high relief at that moment, that I had never made the connection of, I've written several books where I do explore certain situations in the Holocaust, that I hadn't made that connection. And that changed me forever, and then I also, when we were building our characters, who we, Black, white, Jewish, Christian, we love these characters. And the realization that Jacob has to write a letter to William's beloved because William has been denied the ability to read and write, and he can't communicate in that way, was absolutely gutting to me. When your character that you love so much and you realize, what he has endured, it just made everything, history, come alive for me, and to absorb it in a way that was never possible when I was learning as a child in the classroom.
Right. And actually, you just hit on what my next question was going to be about. So you're a psychic. I was going to bring that up. The fact that, of course, there are two couples in this book, and there is a difference in the way that they are able to communicate with one another. Just you touched on it a little bit there, but did you want to expound on that, either one of you?
Absolutely. When we go back to the original idea, the reason why I thought of William bringing the map to his beloved, at the time she didn't have a name, to embroider is because of his limitations in communication, right? The way you break a people is you take away their opportunity to record their history, to share their stories, to give direction and guidance. So that idea that William and Stella, when they love, have to communicate in other ways was really important, right? Even there's a scene in there where William is saying hello to his friend Jacob. He sees him across a field, and he actually plays notes. And it's not that William doesn't have the ability to be like, hey, Jacob, what's up? It's because there's this constant sense of people communicating love in a different way. And I think that really happens often to people who are marginalized or whose stories are stolen, who are traumatized. Even the communication between the Black women in the house is maybe different than we might expect, right? Maybe the mother can't say to her daughter, I love you and I know you're about to go into something difficult, but maybe she spent some extra time like straightening out the back of your hair, pretty much. Like that there are ways that people show love that is available to them, and it may not be all of the ways, but you have to be a little bit quiet and listen out. It might not be in a beautiful letter like Lily is able to provide. It may be in the first chapter, I'm not giving anything away, when Stella and William exchange really small gifts, right? William gives Stella a cowrie shell that he has from his mother, and she gives him a handkerchief. You know, it doesn't say any words on it. It doesn't say, I love you. It just has some flowers. But that's the manner of love and the communication that they have. And I think that's something that should be explored too, like the different level of communication we allow people.
Right, right. Yeah, because it's something that you really wouldn't think about, but the fact that not knowing what happened to your people, I mean, not that the communication was great like it is now anyway, but just the fact for the Black soldiers and the Black families, it would be even more challenging.
Yeah.
Um, One of the other things, just in telling the story of the Civil War, knowing that there were a lot of Black men who went to fight, but as Alyson mentioned earlier, they went, well, they were allowed to come under the pretense of going to fight, but in many cases, that really wasn't what they were there for.
Yeah, they weren't given the ability to fight. They were there to fight, but they, were given pickaxes and hoes instead of muskets, and forced to do manual labor and to be degraded in that way, instead of giving them the valiant opportunity to fight, with a rifle, with a musket.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then, I mean, Shaunna can talk about, she went to Port Hudson to walk in the, footsteps of these Black soldiers who were finally given the opportunity to fight, but they weren't given a fair
They weren't
field.
given a fair chance. I mean, Port Hudson is, I grew up about an hour and a half away from Port Hudson, and I'm ashamed because I don't recall ever having been taught about it. We've all seen the wonderful movie Glory with Denzel in that single tear. And I guess I always thought that the 54th Regiment in Massachusetts was the first corps of African American soldiers who were allowed to actually fight. But the Battle of Port Hudson took place weeks earlier. And the reason why it's a tragedy is because the Union officers, whether it was through just neglect or malfeasance, they just didn't do the right reconnaissance. And hundreds of Black men were just sent into a blind shooting alley, and they were massacred, and their bodies laid there for weeks. And this is historical fact. This does figure into our book, but because it's historical fact, I'm sharing it. It's not really a spoiler. I went to that field. I talked with the park ranger. I stood there with my husband. I felt the tragedy. I felt the souls of people who, really had risked their lives to get there, and then their lives were squandered. And I think that we sometimes, it's convenient to just think of the Union Army like this is this battle between good and evil, and they were fighting for rights. But like, Black people for the Union Army too were a problem, right? When they first joined the Union Army trails and they were thought of as contraband, they were more mouths to feed. So even though they were running away from slavery, the Union Army turned around and said, great, free labor or free cannon fodder. And I think that as much as we want to think about the greatness of actually vanquishing slavery, we have to be really real about the motivations of the federal government and the Union Army. It was not necessarily to eradicate slavery. It was to keep an economic engine called the United States of America together. And I think that Alyson and I didn't want to shy away from that. It's not to say that there weren't a lot of great, noble ideas spurring a lot of people, but at bottom, Black people were a problem no matter which side of the army you were on.
Right, right. One of the things about William specifically, I mentioned earlier, he's from Sapelo Island, which I have familial ties to. So, and he is, he is a musician and all of that. So that's kind of where he and Jacob formulate this bond over music. But why Sapelo Island? What made you choose that specific place to have William be from, being that a lot of the action is taking place in like Mississippi and Louisiana?
That's 100. I mean, I remember the moment very vividly because I had never heard of the Sea Islands or the, Gullah Geechee heritage prior to my first conversation with Shaunna when we sat down to brainstorm writing the book. And she was the one who shared with me how on the Sea Islands on the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, there was this rich heritage that came from Africa. Whereas I think you mentioned earlier in the interview how during the slave trade, they basically took enslaved women and children and men from places where they knew they could be an asset on the plantation, where they knew how to dye indigo and farm it and to cultivate rice and to clean it. And they had these incredible skills that they exploited. But I was also, again, like where I felt like I never heard of this. We need to share this with our readers. We want this manuscript that we're going to create to be filled with things that people are learning at every page, and that it doesn't feel didactic where we're teaching you, but that you're learning through walking in the footsteps of your characters, falling in love with them, rooting for them. And so we also wanted to create a language in telling the story that was very visual, that was very sensory rich. So this idea of coming from an indigo plantation where, yes, he's born with this incredible musical skill, but that you could see the dye in the vats and the floating leaves, and his father Isaiah pounding that and being knowledgeable and strong, and all of those colors of blue that are also, threaded through the book, come from those beginning scenes on Sapelo Island. So it was strategic in the sense that it was a source of so much history and culture, and that so many people don't know. And then also when we went there, I told you before we started the interview how incredible it was to be brought to this praise house where spirituals were sung, and that does play in something in the plot of our book. But we felt the ghosts in that room. We felt, as they sang songs that had been passed down through the centuries, that they soaked through our skin. We carried them with us when we left, and we wanted to bring that into the book of how that's a source for William's connection to music. It comes from his mother, it comes from his people. You can put him on Parapet, Camp Parapet or on Port Hudson, but he is born there and he carries it with him. And we wanted the readers to feel that.
And Shaunna, do you have ties there as well? Or is it just something that you knew about from studying?
It's something that I knew about. I don't have ties there that I know of, but because my parents brought me there when I was very little, we did all of the requisite, like you do the civil rights tour, then you do the Gullah Islands, and they wanted me to know that there is a place where our heritage has been kept somewhat intact and that it wasn't all diluted. And so they brought their children there to see it. And I remember thinking, these people are so resilient because they're resistant, because everything in the system is geared towards stripping something from you. And yet when we went to the island, and Alyson will tell you, we had this wonderful mother and daughter tour guides. We thanked them in our novel. They even at some point started speaking in patois, right, between them. And even now they've been able to retain their heritage. So that was important. But having grown up in New Orleans, once we determined that William was going to be a musician, I also wanted him to be in New Orleans because I've been so steeped in like the multiculturality of New Orleans and the fact that you have all of these people who are existing at gradations of color that weren't really visible other places during that time. Like you had people who were biracial and had a certain set of rights. You had people that were fully African and had a certain set of rights. You had free Black people of color, a thriving community, which one of the characters in our book is from that community. And I wanted to also show that there's so many different experiences of being Black in this country. Even in the 1860s, there were different experiences of being Black. And I think those are stories that deserve some limelight too. So it was convenient in a way, even though we created it, to have William be a musician, because if you're a musician, you can certainly fit in New Orleans, right?
Right. Like you mentioned, Congo Square and all that,
Exactly.
which is in New Orleans. But speaking of differences within families, we see that specifically with Stella, because her mother, her sister, they all have different experiences of being Black women at that time.
Absolutely. That was important for me. It was really important to explore the different opportunities based on color. I, like many Black people, have a lot of different shades in my family. Some of my Daddy's people have gone off and passed, and my mother, she's more chocolatey brown like me, her and her family. And you can kind of trace sometimes the fates of a family based on their shade. And colorism is alive and awful, and we still perpetuate it. And I wanted to explore that. Like, what does it look like for three women to look slightly different? You know, I don't, if you recall, there's a scene pretty early on where all three of them are in the mirror and they're basically comparing their shades and how their fates differ based on how adjacent, frankly, to whiteness that they are. And that, even though they love each other fiercely, even though it's sometimes maybe not showing up in the way you would expect it to. Their different circumstances are always playing out in the backdrop as well, right? In their relationship.
Hmm. One of the other things is the area that they live. I found that very powerful. On I'm probably gonna get it wrong. The name of the street that they live on, is it
Rampart and Burgundy. They're two
Rampart Street? Yes, Rampart Street. Um, there's a community, but tell us, for those who haven't read it, just a little bit about what Rampart Street was all about and how that played out in like New Orleans culture.
Alyson, you want to dive in, or you want me to
Well,
take
I
it?
want you to, because again, it would be you're
Yeah.
from New Orleans, and that was all you.
So we have a community of women that kind of surround Stella and Janie and Amine, and those are all names from my family as well. And they are other women of color, and they are also living in arrangements. And I'm going to say arrangements, but really, I want to be clear: they are owned by white men, and they are kept there for their pleasure. But in spite of the fact that they're living in these circumstances, they also have this community where they may not all be friends, but they support each other, right? When times are difficult, you can go to someone, you can borrow some resources. When they're welcoming a new member into their community, Stella, even though she is devastated to be there, they're coming together. I don't want to give too much away, but they're coming together to give that her the kind of comfort that they can in spite of their limited choices. So they are there in spite of the fact that they don't have, they can't run away, they're stuck in the situation, but they're building a thriving community. And there were women not only in New Orleans but in all of these places where bondage was real, who were kept not only for labor, they were kept in sexual servitude. And that's something that we're just now starting to be okay with admitting. I think it's something that has been the dirty little secret of slavery. But clearly, we can't all be all of these different shades if it was a
Right.
do not touch policy. So I think for us, it was important to show that. But you will note in the book, for anyone who's wondering, like, if there was going to be, scenes of great trauma, one of the things that Alyson and I decided pretty early on is we didn't want to shy away from the hard things, but we were both not interested in voyeuristic scenes of Black people being hurt. So we have closed doors with Stella and the master that she has. There is always a suggestion of what she's going through, but we wanted to focus people more on the tender scenes with William, the times with her family. It's not that her master is, totally off to the side, but we introduce him when we need to. We don't want to sit there and be voyeuristic about the pain that so many real life women went through.
And I
And
appreciated that. Yeah, I appreciated that as a reader, because a lot of times, what do people call it, trauma porn, so to
yeah,
speak.
yeah,
And this book isn't that, but still tells, a powerful story. And we're grown, we can read between the lines and
yeah.
understand, some of the things that were happening. But I appreciate you all for not doing that, so thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. But women in general, I mean, there was this community, but Lily had a community too in New York.
Right, she did. And just like on Rampart Street, where there was almost I don't really want to say mentoring, but this sense of a protective arm embracing you in a time where you needed to become a stronger woman. I feel Lily has that with a woman who is a real life historical figure by the name of Ernestine Rose, who was a Jewish immigrant to the United States, who was an abolitionist, She ended up being a suffragette as well. We discovered that she also was an entrepreneur. She was the one who discovered how to put perfume on paper that lines your drawers to this day.
Wow.
So she was someone that we wanted to have be not just a protective female friend for Lily, but also someone who inspired her, who made her dig deep and become a better her best, to find that person who could be strong and to use her voice. And so that was important. And I think she's the one who at first suggests that Lily create this sewing circle to make quilts that to be sent down south to the Union Army as winter approached. And I think Lily at first, if I remember correctly, she's a little offended. Like, I don't want to be sewing. I want to be out there,
right. I want to march. I want to speak.
Exactly. She doesn't want to be sitting sewing, but she does find when she's put in this group of other women who are trying to, do what they can to contribute to the war, the war effort, that they all have a story, right? That they all, one has just lost a husband, one, is struggling, to find her way. And that also happens down on Rampart Street. Every woman has a story. We don't spend as much time with their story as we do with Stella and Amine and Janie or Lily, but they all have a history. They're all trying to survive. They're all trying to contribute to becoming their best selves, even if there's, resources are limited and all of them have to make certain sacrifices. So there was that parallel. But to be fair, of course, we also wanted to show the contrast. Here Stella is taking apart, I don't want to give away too much, but trying to repurpose what she has around her to create these maps. And there's all this abundance with the women in Lily's circle. There's an embarrassment of riches almost, and that also is reality, that we wanted to highlight that it was not the same for a white woman, even if she's Jewish in New York, as it was for a woman in sexual bondage down in New Orleans. So, these were conversations that I think we were always having, Shaunna, that we were like, we wanted to be factually accurate and make you love our characters, but they didn't have a level playing field at all. So that's part of the story, to highlight that.
Absolutely.
Right. They definitely did not, but it wasn't level. But I guess for me, just to see the power of women made up minds
exactly
together and working together to bring about change.
Yes, to contribute to that change, to move it forward, so that was important to us.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So, wow, there's so much. I'm making sure I hit on all the things that I want to hit on. Now, of course, motherhood is also a theme that comes up because we have mothers who have decisions and choices to make, from William's mom, Stella's mom, and then Stella herself at a certain point has to make a decision. How important was it for you all to include that as a part of the story?
Incredibly. So Stella, I don't know if I mentioned already, Stella's named after my mother. So I had to make sure that Stella had a growth story, and Amine and Janie are also family names. But I thought a lot about it, and I have sisters as well. So when we were conceiving of Stella and Amine and Janie, I thought a lot about the advice that women who have to live through really terrible circumstances, how they have to raise their children, right? How they have to raise their daughters and their sons to live within the strictures. And that's why, without giving too much away, some of the most important conversations that Alyson and I had when we were creating these characters. And people sometimes think that, like, I wrote the Black characters and she wrote the white and Jewish characters, but that didn't happen. We did this together, and we would have conversations about the choices the characters would make. Some of my initial suggestions, I think, were probably really perplexing to Alyson. Like, well, would a mother really give that advice, or wouldn't she react this way? And it was a chance for us to discuss that it's not an absence of love, but it's the primacy of survival, right? Like, if you've been from generations being torn from your family, and you know that if you put your daughter in a certain situation, you're going to get to live near her, you're going to get to see her. she's going to stay out of the field. She's going to stay like, you're making different decisions than you do if, no shade, but you're living up in Brooklyn with all of these things around you and all of these choices. Like the limitation of choices changes how you parent. And so I think that was something that was really, really important for us to delve into. And yeah, that's something that we spoke about a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is important. It's the things you think about, because we've heard all kinds of stories of things that mothers during the time of slavery, a lot of choices that mothers would have to make, sometimes, killing their children or whatever they would have to do just so their children wouldn't have to endure, some of the horrors of slavery. So that was really powerful to see and to show all of those different things. You just hit on something though, writing a story together. How was that process for you guys? I mean, besides the fact that you're friends and you've shared all these stories, but yeah, you pick up a book and it doesn't say, well, Shaunna wrote these lines, Alyson wrote these lines. So
it's so interesting because every time we do an interview, people always allude to the fact that they think that one of us, Shaunna wrote the Black characters and I wrote the white, Jewish characters. And that wasn't the case at all. I think from the moment we came together and decided we were going to undertake this project, we were in 100% agreement that we wanted to create one seamless voice that was going to run through the book. We weren't going to have it in first person where, you heard Stella telling her story and then Lily telling her story. We wanted it to read like an epic that has light and dark and hope and, all of those things that make something that really touches your soul and that you carry with after you finish the last page. So how do you do that? Thank God for technology. I mean, because, we, and again, this was my 8th novel. I've done 7 before, all by myself, solitary in my room. The only voice inside my head were the characters and myself. I couldn't pick up the phone and, ask a friend what happens next in my book. But with Shaunna, we created a Google Doc that would become the final manuscript, where we continually were revising and refining and making every chapter as good as it could be before we advanced forward. We had brainstorming sessions every Sunday night with what was going to happen plot-wise. Shaunna does have a full-time day job, so I was always the one who took the first pass of taking what we had discussed together, putting it like a sketch on the page, and then using that to build, so that almost as if you had this wire armature where you're applying clay and making it until you see the full form. That was the way we did it. And, in the beginning, I was really, saying to Shaunna, oh, I don't think I can do any of the dialogue, of the characters down south. You do all the dialect. And I feel too nervous to write any scenes where someone's doing, Stella or Aminé's hair. And she said, okay, I'll, make sure that I. But then as we started getting more comfortable and finding that voice, which is like the essence of like who, how we were telling the story, I did, become more comfortable taking a pass at that. And of course, she had to go back and, of course, make changes every now and then and do things. But we became more brave and courageous as we were creating that. And, Shaunna would say, I think a Jewish prayer should come here at this particular scene. Or do we want to have a backdrop between the brothers during Passover? And, those type of suggestions that we were always in this, conversation with each other, where we were learning about each other's heritage and then feeling that we could start suggesting things to happen in each other's, characters that became all of our characters, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I will say we had more than one Google Doc, because we also had a research Google Doc. We were both
right.
And anytime we came across something that was new to us or that we didn't know, in one of Lily's letters to Jacob, she writes about the burning of the colored children's asylum in New York on 43rd and 5th Avenue. And I live in New York now. This is something that I had not been aware of, that during the draft riots in July of 1863, a mob of hundreds of white people attempted to burn over 200 Black children alive in an orphanage. But miraculously, right, they were all saved, and one of the little girls got out with a Bible that's still held today in the New York Historical Society. That's the kind of thing we would come up with, and we put it in our research Google Doc, and we'd say, we have to find a way to use this, right? Because if we are knee deep in this, we both consider ourselves relatively educated and empathetic, and we haven't heard of it, there's like an obligation for us to share it with everyone else. So we had like our manuscript Google Doc, and then we had the all the interesting things that we have to find a way to fit in. Now we did not manage to fit interesting things in, but I will say that that was really a touchstone for us.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and that's something because I know you were talking about the just all of the things that you needed to include and history and including things that we don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
So I know you mentioned you started talking about it a little bit in 17. You really didn't start writing until 20. So how I'm gonna mute you for a second while you're drinking. For while you were working on that, how long did it take you, like the research piece of that? Were you kind of writing and researching at the same time,
We
or was
were
it more?
doing everything at the same time. We were writing and we were researching. And while the pandemic was incredibly difficult to live through, obviously, it certainly freed up the calendar, right? So,
Right.
I mean, we were, thank goodness for all of these resources online. We were sending emails to research librarians. We were, downloading books. We were watching documentaries. And then when things opened up a little bit, me being from New Orleans, when I would go home to see my mama, Stella, like I would take the opportunity to go to places like Port Hudson, check the street names at Rampart. There's a church that's featured, go to the church and do all of these things that we needed to do. And then the last trip that we took, which we finally felt comfortable enough to take it together, was when we went to the Gullah Islands, and we actually went there, and we were fortunate enough to take Allison's daughter,
Oh
who's
wow.
16 now, and I think it was just really lovely to write this book where motherhood plays a part in a community of women, and to bring her and have her go on this research trip with us. It was absolutely
And
lovely.
then we had a mother-daughter team who was, based there, that was sharing their heritage and seeing their connection, and how they had, they were exchanging stories that were passed down between, each, from their grandmother to the mother to the daughter, and we were privy to that. Just made it so special.
Hmm. And one of the things I mentioned up front, and it's true. Alyson, you have part of your history is in the book. Shaunna,
Mhm.
some of your history, bits and pieces of your history are in the book as well. How important is it that we share our family histories or talk to those people who are older that maybe can tell us more about our history? How important is it that we continue to do that?
I mean, I would say it's the ultimate act of defiance, right? We're both from heritages where people try to take those stories away. It is your obligation, even when it's uncomfortable, because my mother runs from me, to sit down, turn on the tape recorder, grab the pencil and pad, and get those stories, because that's really at the end of the day all we have to pass on. Everything else is dust. I truly
It's
believe that.
Yeah, and I think, what Sean and I are discovering now at this point, that the book is out and we're getting these wonderful opportunities to talk about the research and the history of of where we came from and what we wanted to do with this book, that we're having opportunities now to talk about other angles of the novel. For example, we're hoping to do a talk with the Museum of Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans, and they asked Shaunna and I to if we do the talk at the end of October, to bring certain family heirlooms that have been passed on, through our families, and to talk about how they inspired creativity, but also how they, basically forge connections with our ancestors. And Shaunna has these amazing quilts in her family's collection. Some of them still have the cotton seeds in the batting. She has
Oh
this
wow.
one beautiful framed part of a dress that was made from is it your great grandmother's field dress and your
My
grandmother's field
grandmother's, my great
dress?
grandmother's children.
And so the history is literally sewn in with these garments. And so I had recently reached out to my mother to ask if there was anything that she had that connected us to these two uncles, that I have in, the Civil War. And my uncles, obviously, their sister was my great great grandmother. So my mother and her sister have all these artifacts, all these heirlooms that they did not share with me growing up. But because I picked up the phone and
Right.
asked, they were like, "Oh, we actually have her." In Hebrew, it's called the ketubah. It's the marriage certificate. You know what they were married. My great grandmother with my great great grandfather in New York in 1860. And
Wow.
so I looked at that, and my first was like, oh my goodness, I never knew this existed. You know, it was up in my aunt's attic. But then there's another part of me that thinks in 1860, Shauna's relatives couldn't have been married, you know, and that
Mm,
realization that
that's
how
true. Very.
yeah, unfair that was. So while I have this precious heirloom, my heart is also wedded to my sister over there, Shaunna, who will know, you know, that wasn't possible. That, you know, marriage was denied that time for her people, and so there's this. I think I'm permanently changed from that. I feel grateful that my family still has these heirlooms that show marriage, that show the birth of a child. You know, my mother still has my great great grandmother's purse that she used. You know, these things that were precious and that were saved. But then there's, you know, the shadow of that there's a, you know, so many things, you know, that other people in America at that time were denied, and so it's that sort of dialogue that I think isn't. I'm so grateful that it's continuing even after we've written the book. I suppose that's what I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to say, that we're still having these epiphanies
We're
and making
still
these
learning.
connections, and we're still learning. And, you know, there's gratitude and there's also, you know, outrage, you know, so it's it's been really life changing.
Right. Yes, and as I mentioned to you earlier, it's making me want to dig deeper because, as I mentioned, a connection to Sapelo Island that I
Mhm.
have, and over last weekend, well, just yesterday, a couple days ago, I was in Southern Ohio where my dad's people. Where he grew up, and I was hearing stories about different things. I drove past the cemetery where my great grandmother was buried, and like, wow, just thinking of all that history and grow in that part of the country, there's just so much to learn and to explore, and just to be able to understand where we came from, and that sometimes that when we think about what others have gone through for us to be where we are, it can inspire us to do even more and be even greater, because we know that there are a lot of sacrifices that were made for us to do the things that we're doing today.
That's
So
absolutely, yeah.
what are you guys working on next?
Well, Allison is
You
working
can tell.
something individually, which I'll let her tell you about. But I will say that we've already started to dream about where these characters might go. For those of you who haven't read The Thread Collectors yet, we don't tie it up in a neat little bow. There is a hopeful ending, but there's a lot more to say about these characters. And we know that after the Civil War came Reconstruction. And that's something that a lot of people aren't familiar with, about the promise of Reconstruction and all the strides that, in particular, Black people made, but also some of the promises that were broken. And I think we could see our characters moving forward during that time. Now, I still have a full time job, so I got to figure that out. But I feel like if we did it once, we could do it again.
Yeah.
But Allison also has another book.
Yeah, and I've been working on a book that it involves a Vietnamese refugee child, a Vietnam veteran, and an Irish immigrant. Their lives entwining in the late 1970s on the backdrop of Long Island, and how this friendship basically helps all three characters heal from previous trauma.
So that sounds interesting as well. Sounds interesting as well. So we'll be looking forward to all of that. And of course, you mentioned you all are doing some events and things like that. Anything that people can join you at, either virtually or in person?
Well, we have a list of our events at thethreadcollectors.com. There's an event click that you can, or I guess a link, and then you can see all of our events. Most of the virtuals are listed, and then we I think we're going to something like 22 cities in person. So
Oh,
hopefully
wow.
people will be able to find a place that we're visiting and join in. And also a lot of them are hybrid too, so you can always sort of find a virtual link as well.
All right, so that I didn't post it, but it's thethreadcollectors.com, the name of the book. So,
Yes.
and we have Andra saying, yes, we want to see how they handle the transition. Yes, yes,
Thank you, Andra.
yes, yeah, because that's one thing. Sometimes people try to tie it up in a neat bow and rush through it, or or it makes it a 600-page book. Doing it all in one. So it's good to know that you all have already started to think about what's next. So believe it or not, we are at time. So it's been such a pleasure talking to both of you. As I mentioned, I really, really enjoyed the book, and now I'm like, okay, there's some more digging I need to do, just in terms of my own family history and things like that I really got from reading this, and just thinking about some of our experiences in my family. So I'm looking forward to that, and I thank you all for inspiring me to do that.
Well, thank you for having us.
Oh yes, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to the rest of the BGC community. This was a lot of fun.
Yes.
Oh yes, I enjoyed it, and hoping it won't be the last time. It won't be the last time. Not at all. So I'm gonna let you all go for a second, but hang on, don't go off yet. But I just want to make the announcement about the next couple of books. So just hold on one second. So everyone who's watching live, thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you again here real soon with some of the other authors that we have coming up next week, September 26th, which is actually my birthday. Yes. I'm actually going to work on my birthday, and I will have Latoya Watkins with me to talk about her latest book, Perish. And then 2 weeks from today, on the 3rd of October, I will have Catherine Adele West to talk about The Two Lives of Sarah. And this is her second time being with us, her second book, and her second visit to the BGC Book Club. So everyone, thank you again for your time. Thank you for joining us. And you have a great rest of the evening, or if you're watching during the day, great rest of the day, great rest of the afternoon. Thanks again. Bye-bye.